Good morning, everybody. Like Arif, I'd like to express my thanks to the ICLARS Consortium. It's, I think, the first conference at ICLARS that I'm ever attending, so it's a pleasure to be with you. Many familiar faces, actually, because I think I know you from other contexts and fora and so on. And also thanks in particular to Silvio Ferrari, who, I can see. Thank you, Silvio, for making it difficult or even impossible to say no to your invitation to take part in this conference. So, so you can see my title is slightly suggestive of something, but I don't say which way I'm going to answer the question, right? So it could go along with the kind of dominant trend that the rest of my panelists, co-panelists have kind of advocated and say, well, of course, there's nothing preventing freedom of religion as a human rights idea to take to spread, to take root in different contexts and so on, just because it may emerge from a Christian theological context. So I'll try to answer that without giving away my answer too quickly. Okay, just by way of preface, my conference title obviously brings together the conference title of this conference brings together a number of prepositions combining and qualifying both the two terms freedom and religion, right? Now, obviously here we have four prepositions that we're dealing with. Earlier this year in April, we had a conference in Trento where some people were present, who are present here as well, where I try to deal with at least two of those prepositions and try to combine them by arguing that the freedom from religion and freedom of religion are actually part of a single move. And I try to argue that in the context of the caste discrimination legislation which we now have in Britain, and with reference to the caste system which Indians are supposed to have, let's say, instituted and perpetuated for centuries on end. Now, there I try to argue that the freedom of true religion, that the way to actually see them as both as part of a single move, is that the freedom of true religion depends on freedom from false religion. So actually they become combined in a single particular move. Now, here actually we're being asked partly to discuss the problem of impossibility, right? David Little, already you've provided a very powerful kind of critique of the project by Winifred F. Sullivan in the United States, and it looks like you're having a nice fight over there in the United States with each other, which is kind of fairly entertaining for the rest of the world, for us to view, but also actually has some there are some germs of insights which I think are quite useful for the rest of us as well to pursue, I think. I don't think the debate is extinguished yet. It will go on, and I think it will continue to generate very many important insights. Now, as you rightly say, right, one of Winifred Sullivan's critiques is that it's impossible to police the line where religion begins and ends. I think you express it differently by saying that she argues that the definitional problem of religion, which is, she does say that as well, is sort of lies at the root of the dilemma that a clause like the First Amendment of the United States or the human rights documents in the international instruments face. And of course she makes a very strong case for saying that religious freedom is actually destroyed in the name of its protection. Right? So the way in which various judgments in the United States have gone, actually indicative of the fact that they don't respect the way in which religion is lived among US citizens, right, or US residents of the United States, but impose a particular kind of textualist and legalistic idea of religion. I think in a way she manages, I would be charitable to her and say, she manages to make the case insofar as her references are the kind of cases that US courts have tended to decide in the way in which they have decided them. Okay, but here I want to talk about impossibility in a slightly different sense, not in the sense that she talks about, although I believe that the broader approach that I'm taking also can account for the kind of factual material that she's dealing with. And I would say that it supplies a better explanation also for the kind of material that she's using. She and the other members of the sort of the larger collaborative team which she's become part of. So, how do I do that? So my strategy is to say, first of all, we have to be aware of the backdrop of the idea of religious freedom, and in a way, I think it's not a contentious statement to say that freedom of religion arises, the germ of the freedom of religion idea arises in a Christian theological context. And there are many people here actually better qualified than me, canon lawyers, theologians, and so on, to actually perhaps ratify that initial statement, right? That initial kind of claim that there is some kind of relationship between the freedom of religion and Christian theology. Now, if we trace its roots, then we can see that in an early form, religious freedom actually took the form of Christian freedom. And in fact, of course, among Christians, it still takes it retains that form. And later on, of course, was included, or it was extended to include the freedom of the church as well. And these were said to be primarily enjoyed, particularly Christian freedom by monks, and then later on, as extended to the freedom of the church, priests were said to be the primary subjects, if you like, of such a freedom. Now, of course, with the Protestant Reformation, there was a significant break, right? And Jacob de Roover, on whose work I'm specifically relying, talks about the Protestant Reformation as a moment of secularization. Right? Now, I've used secularization and secularized at least twice and highlighted it, and I need to say something about what do I mean by secularization. Now, here I'm using secularization or secularized in a very specific sense. I don't use it in the way in which, let's say, Charles Taylor uses it, or Jose Casanova uses it, in the sense that there is a kind of transformation in the way in which Christian belief has, if you like, manifests itself today and as compared to yesteryear. That's not the way in which I'm referring to secularization. Secularization here I'm using in a very specific theoretical sense, and to me that it entails the spread of Christian ideas as part of the common sense of the culture. Right? The spread of Christian ideas in a non-theological guise, to become part of the common sense of the culture. Right? That's secularization. There are further extensions of that idea as well, but that's it in a kind of basic form. Right? So this is the way in which I'm using the term secularized and secularization, and that's quite important for later, actually. Now, of course, the Protestant Reformation entails the monasticization of daily life, which is part and parcel of this process of secularization, in the sense that Christian freedom comes to be enjoyed or enjoyable, right, by the general population, general Christian body of Christians, rather than merely the monks and the priests. I think it was Karl Marx who said something like Martin Luther. By turning priests into laymen, he turned laymen into priests, right? So that's kind of another way of expressing this idea of monasticization of daily life. And therefore, the monastic process of conversion, originally associated with monks, was supposed to shape the lives of all believers. Now, of course, we also know that in Protestant accounts, the priests and governments were not to regulate the affairs of private conscience. And of course, this entails a kind of what Jacob de Roover refers to as a political theology of two kingdoms. Right? So existence, in a way, becomes split, right, between the sacred and the secular, spiritual, temporal, soul and body. And of course, some of these are sort of variously combined, if you like, in other types of pairs as well. And one could go on and on. Now, so from Christian freedom, we get to religious freedom. So the earlier ideas of Christian freedom and freedom of the church have developed, right, from a political theology into political legal theory. These are now, as we've already heard, reflected in legal documents such as the United States First Amendment and other laws. And religious freedom also enters into the constitutions of so many different countries, legal systems, right, around the world. So, and not only in the Western world, right? Religious freedom is an idea which is expressed, let's say, in the Constitution of India, in the Constitution of Japan, in the Constitution of, I think, Indonesia as well. Chinese have some kind of expression of religious freedom. So actually, it seems like the constitutions and legal systems governing most of the world's population somehow have some kind of reference to religious freedom, right? So in a way, you can say, well, if I'm just going to stop there, right, at some kind of legal expression, I would have to answer my question in the negative, right? In the sense that just because something is emerged in a Christian theological context doesn't mean that its use or application in a different kind of cultural context is impossible. On top of that, we also today have the spread of agencies and bodies to police, monitor religious freedom. So we have some United States bodies, in particular we know of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which monitors the enjoyment of religious freedom everywhere in the world except the United States itself, because you have your Supreme Court to do that job for you. And of course, what I've also noticed, and I think probably many people know about this already, sort of new for me, is that there's also a spread of different parliamentary and other types of official bodies, right, within the context of various governments, particularly in the Western world. So in Canada, in Britain, we also have a parliamentary committee to police religious freedom, which issues its own reports. I think the European Union also has a similar type of body. So we have a spread of such bodies to monitor and police religious freedom, right? And I would emphasize also, particularly, they seem to have taken root in the Western world. And it might be an interesting thing to speculate why it is that they've popped up over the last 20 years in particular, right? Particularly since the US Committee on International Religious Freedom was established. Now, okay, you do have the expression in many different documents, legal documents, both international and national level, but globally, idea of religious freedom, right? But it still, I would argue, presupposes the kind of Protestant framework from which it emerged. And the argument is that it's not intelligible without this Protestant theology as a background framework, right, to make it intelligible. Now you can see the way in which I'm going to answer the question, potentially. So the argument further relies on two, if you like, notions. Yeah, one notion is the conditions of possibility, and the second one, as I mentioned, the conditions of intelligibility. And I think I would argue that Protestant theology becomes both the condition of possibility and the condition of intelligibility for religious freedom. Right? And I would go on further to argue that these conditions are not present in other non-Western cultures of the world. The mere recitation of the mantra, I say rather derogatory or rather pejoratively, does not mean that religious freedom makes sense in other cultural contexts, right? And this is actually a very specifically, I think he's not here, Heiner Bielefeld is not here, but in the conference where I last met him, where I sort of presented a version of this argument, he said that, well, actually, many people do talk about religious freedom throughout the world, so that means it must make sense to them. Yeah? In a way that, to that extent, it exists in other parts of the world. Yeah? It has meaning for people who exist or from cultures in other parts of the world. So this is kind of a response to his response to me. Right? So my argument would be just the fact that people simply recite religious freedom as a mantra, right? Doesn't mean that they necessarily understand or have access to the kind of background framework that makes it intelligible for them. Right? And so we can predict, in fact, furthermore, if we go on, we can say that the idea of religious freedom will be distorted, it will break down, and it will actually end up creating conflict in cultures in which they simply don't make sense, these ideas of religious freedom and cognate concepts. Right? And finally, I would say the onus is on those who claim global application of religious freedom to overcome these intellectual hurdles, right? These arguments which rely on conditions of possibility and conditions of intelligibility, to show that it is religious freedom is an intelligible idea. I think I will stop there. Maybe that might be enough to provoke any questions. I was told to keep it short. Right?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? Hey, it's okay. I don't need it. Please.